Okay, so the movie is rolling. We are going to start recording on the iPad in 3, 2, 1, roll. Okay, class, good morning. Happy Monday. Welcome to school. I hope you guys had a great weekend and you got some time to relax or go someplace or do some things, get away from school a little bit. I'm sorry that I won't be with you today. I am right now recording this at about 5:37 on Thursday evening of last week, but as you're watching this right now, I will actually be on a beach somewhere in Cancun, Mexico. So I hope the snow is treating you well, but I'm not dealing with that right now. So you can be jealous if you want. That's okay. The beach is going to be nice. I guarantee it. So I have the Chapter 19 lecture for you here today. This is going to be a pretty similar format to what we did with the Chapter 18 lecture, a little video lecture for you here. The wonders of technology allow me to shoot this out to you even though I'm not there right now. So let's go ahead and get started with some housekeeping. Very first thing, before we get to any of the official housekeeping, we have to check out our moral support for the day. And it looks like we have one kitty down here. It's actually a different kitty than we had last time. And he's currently taking a bath right now. And you can kind of see he's got a red sweater on because, unfortunately, he's having a little allergic reaction to something right now. We're not sure what's going on, so he's got a little, itchy spot on the back of his neck. But it's a different cat than we had before. I don't know where our other one was. Maybe he's sulking again. But once again, we have some moral support from our fuzzy friends to make it through. So let's go ahead and get started today. So got 3 items for housekeeping for you. Don't forget that we have the Chapter 19 quiz and reading guide due on Tuesday. So you'll listen to the lecture today, and then you will have the 19 quiz, which will be take-home format that should be posted up on Google Classroom with the password as a class comment. So you'll be able to take that as soon as you feel that you are ready. And don't forget that the reading guide will also be due at the end of the day tomorrow, which should be Tuesday. Moving forward into the rest of the week, you have a Chapter 20 reading guide that will be due Thursday night. And the Chapter 20 quiz, will be due Friday night. So a little bit different schedule with Chapter 20 versus Chapter 19, just because it's later in the week and you have some more time to do it. So I will be back. So this whole week I'll be gone, but I will be back next Monday, so a week from today. So for the second half of this unit, I will be present there for you. So let's go ahead and pull up this unit schedule as well. Okay. So you can see right here that we are going to be starting a new unit, Unit 10, called Populism, Progressivism, and Foreign Intervention. And this is going to have 3 chapters, just like our last unit. And we will do 10 class days, or 2 weeks. So we will have chapters 19 and 20 this week. And then next week, when I'm back, we will move on to chapter 21. And the test will be coming up next week, Friday. So 3 chapters, 2 weeks, pretty similar breakdown to what we did with the last unit. If you take a look, we will also have an LEQ this unit as well, due on Friday, and I will hand that out on Monday the 4th. Or due on Thursday, rather, and I will hand it out on Monday the 4th. Let's get rid of this notification. Sorry about that. So that's our chapter, or our unit coming up. So there you have it. I think that should be it for housekeeping. So without any further ado, let's hop right back into the lecture. Okay, so chapter 19 is called From Crisis to Empire. So we are going to pick up right about the end of the 1800s. And we spent all of last chapter talking about several big themes and trends that had been taking place between the Civil War, the end of the Civil War in 1865, and the year 1900. And those trends were the settlement of the Far West, they were the Second Industrial Revolution, and they were urbanization and the growth of cities. So we've had several big themes now that have been taking place over the last 3 decades of the 1800s. And the next unit, Unit 10, is going to pick up right at the end of the 1800s, the beginning of the 1900s, and the chapters in this unit are going to be sort of a turning point or an outgrowth or a transition from the big themes that have been happening for the 3 decades at the end of the 1800s. So you want to talk about our historian thinking skill of cause and effect. You can largely think of the last 3 decades of the 1800s in multiple ways having effects that play out in this unit, right? This unit 10, sort of the first decade or two at the beginning of the 1900s. So this chapter 19 is going to be kind of a bridge the gap chapter for us. And it's going to talk about 2 things that, when you take these 2 things together, they are going to mark the natural turning point for us from the 1800s into the 1900s. So this is going to take us from the 19th century to the 20th century, and we talk about the skill of periodization as well. These when we have the trends that we're going to talk about in this chapter, this is when we move into that next period in AP US history. So let's go ahead and talk about this. Obviously, this first slide, we have a picture of the Rough Riders, and you look kind of directly in the middle under that flag. That's our friend Teddy Roosevelt. So if you're a Roosevelt fan, you're going to like this chapter quite a bit. So this chapter 19, From Crisis to Empire. Our time frame that we're looking at is the 1870s to the 1900s. So we're going to talk about some background and context that's going to take us right up to the year 1900, which is going to be kind of the key point in this chapter that we're going to talk about. So the overview, From Crisis to Empire. As the United States approached the end of the 19th century, it looked very different than at the beginning of the Civil War. In response to social and economic marginalization, as well as a severe economic crisis in 1893, a wave of populism shook up the political status quo, which until that point had been in a state of equilibrium. So we're going to have 3 decades of really stable presidential politics, and all of a sudden at the end of the 1800s, bam, you're going to have this wave that's going to change lots of things. So after this wave, this populist wave subsides, the United States opportunistically, if not always unanimously, joined other European nations in the rush to acquire foreign colonies and expand empire. The Spanish-American War in 1898 marked a decisive end to the 19th century, as well as a significant turning point in American history. So it's the Spanish-American War in 1898, right around the end of the 1800s. That's going to mark our turning point. So that's why we kind of called this chapter a bridging the gap chapter. So the bulk of the time frame is technically going to come in our previous period, but this what we call imperialism, the Spanish-American War, this is when we are going to have that turning point that kicks us into the next period. So right here, our picture right here is called this is of a man called William Jennings Bryan. And it's a gold cross right there, and you will find out why that symbol is significant here in a few slides. So the first section of this chapter is called Politics of the Late 19th Century. So this is going to take us up through the political figures, the presidents specifically, from the end of the Reconstruction era up until the beginning of the Imperial era. So diving right into this first bullet point, the big trend that you need to know for the politics of the late 19th century is that it largely existed in a state of equilibrium. So it was very finely balanced. The 2 parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, numerically speaking, were very even. There were about 14 states that leaned Democrat and about 16 states that leaned Republican, and a small handful of states that were pretty much 50-50 and could go either way. So the Democratic and the Republican parties were very evenly matched, both in the raw number of votes and in the Electoral College votes. So presidential elections tended to be very tight affairs with a voter margin of maybe 1 to 2% either way. So the parties were even, but they were also very entrenched as well. So you tended to not see too much flip-flopping from party to party. So the parties were very stable in their makeup and their structure. And they were also very passionate with the support for these parties at this time as well. If you were a Democrat or a Republican, you tended to identify very, very strongly with whichever party you were a member of, and you tended to look very, very negatively at the other party. So even though this was a period of sort of even distribution between the two parties, and we call it equilibrium, so it was balanced, at least when I hear the term equilibrium, I tend to think calm, and it was anything but calm. The two politics, the political parties were very competitive with one another, and the competition was very fierce. So the last two things rather, to note about these two parties is that although they were entrenched, and although they were very fiercely competitive with one another, they actually didn't take policy positions that were all that different from one another. So there were very few things to actually separate what a Democrat might support from what a Republican would support. And in fact, the biggest delineating factor between whether you are a Democrat or a Republican tended to be in what region or culture you came from. So the Democrats tended to be very strong in the South because the Democratic Party was seen as the party that redeemed the South after the Civil War. And the Democratic Party was also very strong in immigrant communities in the Midwest and the Northeast. So among Catholics and Irish, and amongst the southern regions of the country, that was where the Democratic Party was the strongest. And the Republican Party was the strongest amongst the middle class, typically, especially in the North, in the Midwest, and in the Northeast. And then generally in the Northeast as well, the Republican Party was just much stronger with that segment of the country. And whereas Catholics tended to be more supportive of the Democratic Party, Protestants tended to be supportive of the Republican Party. So you can see here that the party breakdown wasn't so much driven by ideology as it was culture, what your families had supported, and then what region of the country that you came from. So it's a little bit different than the way parties are broken apart nowadays. The presidency in the late 1800s was relatively weak when we compare it to the presidents that we have today. The government was still quite small. The executive branch in particular was still quite small in the late 1800s. And in fact, the largest part of the government was actually still the post office. So probably the most important task that the president had to do in the late 1800s was fulfill this function of patronage, which is basically a fancy term that means that all of these jobs that fall under the umbrella of the executive branch were appointed by the president. So the largest number of jobs were actually in the post office. So every time you had a new president get elected to office, he had to re-go through and appoint all of these different jobs, especially post office jobs. And this amounted to something like 100,000 different jobs in the executive branch. And typically these jobs were awarded to political supporters of the president, kind of as a thank you for supporting me. I want to keep you involved with my party. Here's this nice government provided salary job for you. So patronage was typically awarded, these patronage jobs were awarded to supporters of the president. So the first president that we get at the end of or during this time period is Rutherford B Hayes. So Rutherford B Hayes is elected in 1877 after that event that we've talked about called the Compromise of 1877, where Rutherford B Hayes, as the Northern Republican candidate, gets elected. And we can kind of surmise that in exchange for that, he withdrew the Northern troops from the South, which signaled the end of the Reconstruction era. Now, the big event or the big theme of the Hayes administration is going to be a struggle between two groups in the Republican Party called stalwarts and half-breeds. And these two parties were kind of split along conservative lines. So Republicans who wanted to kind of keep politics running the way they had been running, and a group of Republicans called half-breeds, which tended to be a little bit more liberal or reform-minded. And specifically, the issue that split the stalwarts from the half-breeds was patronage. So the stalwarts tended to be in favor of patronage because that's the way politics had worked. This is just the system. This is the way we run this. Patronage is a useful tool to make sure political parties have a reward structure built into them. But half-breeds tended to look at the patronage system and see corruption and incompetence for the workers that were appointed to these positions. So Rutherford B. Hayes in that presidency, he was kind of constantly struggling to get the stalwarts and the half-breeds to work together in Congress. And so the Hayes presidency was probably not as effective as perhaps it could have been without these struggles. So that's what Hayes is primarily known for. So the next president that we get elected is James Garfield, and he is a Republican. If you're looking at the slideshow, that's what GOP stands for. The official name of the Republican Party is actually the Grand Old Party. Fun fact. So if you see the acronym GOP, that stands for Grand Old Party or the Republican Party. So Rutherford B. Hayes is a Republican, and he's elected in the 1876 election. So he serves in office from 1877 to 1880. And, actually talking about the wrong president. Garfield, rather, is elected in the 1880 election, and Garfield is elected based on a reputation of being a reformer. So he is actually a half-breed. Interestingly enough, the Republicans in that 1880 election, they had their presidential candidate who was a half-breed, so a reformer, a more liberal Republican, and his vice presidential candidate, Chester Arthur, was a stalwart and a more traditional conservative Republican. So they put both sides of the Republicans on this ticket, and that was actually a decision that caused quite a bit of unity for the Republicans. So good choice on their part. In any case, James Garfield, elected in 1880, is known as a reformer and a half-breed. And he is actually assassinated. He's shot not too much into his presidency. So he only serves a few months of his presidency, and the person who shoots him is a common Republican who I think was not given a patronage job and was angry about that. So he shoots Garfield and says, "Now Arthur is the president. Long live the patronage system," that sort of thing. So Garfield dies, is out of the picture, and his vice president, Chester Arthur, assumes the presidency. And Arthur, who was a stalwart before being vice president, people thought that with Arthur coming in, he was going to not follow through on these reform efforts that Garfield wanted to get enacted. But Chester Arthur actually surprised a lot of people, because when he assumed the presidency, he actually carried through the system of reforms that were proposed by Garfield. So he actually went after the system of patronage and tried to reform it, which surprised a lot of people. So Arthur embraces the patronage reform, and these reform efforts come out in something called the Pendleton Act, which does away with the patronage system and says that if anybody who's going to get appointed to a government job has to demonstrate competence by taking a civil service exam. So government jobs will go to the highest qualified candidate rather than just political supporters. So that's probably the big thing that Chester Arthur is going to be known for. So looking over there at the pictures on the left, the guy in the far upper left is Rutherford B Hayes. The top right is going to be James Garfield. And the middle left is going to be our friend Chester Arthur. So Chester Arthur is going to serve a single term. And the guy who's going to be elected after him, which is your picture on the middle right, is Grover Cleveland. And Grover Cleveland is going to have the distinction of the only president to serve 2 terms non-consecutively. So he is going to be elected in 1884, become the president in 85. And he's going to be a Democrat. So this is where the presidency goes to a Democrat rather than the Republican. And Grover Cleveland is going to have a reputation as being anti-corruption. So you can kind of sense a theme with some of these politicians that a lot of them are seen as reformers or anti-corruption. And it kind of tells you what the perception of the government was during this time. Grover Cleveland is going to be aided in his election by a group of breakaway Republicans called mugwumps. And these are Republicans who are going to have problems with this political corruption in the Republican Party. So it was a really close election, and the only reason that Cleveland gets elected in the first place is because of this breakaway group of reform-minded Republicans who supports him over the Republican candidate. So Grover Cleveland, part 1, is he's going to be president for about 1 term. The next president that gets elected in 1888 and is going to serve in 89 is a guy named Benjamin Harrison. And he is the relative of former President William Henry Harrison, I believe his grandson, if I'm not mistaken. And Benjamin Harrison is a GOP, so he is a Republican as well. And one of the things to note about Benjamin Harrison, who is our bottom left picture over there, is that he is going to be a rather more traditional Republican. So he's going to want to do that laissez-faire, hands-off type policy. But this isn't going to be a terribly effective tactic for him, because during his presidency, lots of these problems that we've talked about, the issues that people had with capitalism, that tension is going to start to bubble over the surface a little bit. So in Benjamin Harrison's presidency, you're going to have a few issues pop up, one being the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was a law that gave the federal government more powers to combat the trusts and monopolies. And although it's rarely going to be used, at least during the 1880s, it is going to be used a little bit later on in an era that we'll talk about. The other thing that you're going to see during Benjamin Harrison's presidency is the McKinley tariff, which is going to be hugely important because this tariff is going to take tariff rates to the highest level that they had ever been in U.S. history, almost 50% tax on imported goods. So it's going to have a big effect on sheltering monopolies and also increasing the price of goods in the United States. So it's going to be a very divisive measure. Some of the businesses and the conservative Republicans really liked these high tariff rates, but a lot of your Democrats and Western farmers hated this increased tariff rate. So in 1892, Mr. Grover Cleveland is going to be elected largely based on his anti-tariff stance. So the American public is briefly going to not be in support of the McKinley tariff, which is going to lead to Grover Cleveland being elected again. And Grover Cleveland is going to serve the second of his 2 terms. So Benjamin Harrison is going to come in between him there. And I think that is it. Apparently I'm just getting all sorts of notifications here. I apologize for that. All right. Next slide. Okay, so if that's the presidency, right, sort of the series of presidents that we have in the late 1800s, let's talk about some of the trends that we're going to get at the end of this decade. So with the trends that we've been talking about, like the Industrial Revolution and the urbanization in the end of the 1800s, we've talked about some of the causes and effects that these big overarching trends have had, and that some of these effects have been good and some of these have been bad, and that depending on what region of the country that you lived in or what your profession was, that made a difference in whether you were benefited by lots of these big trends or were worse off by a lot of these trends. And the big cohort that is made worse off by these trends of mechanization and industrialization are farmers. So one of the big political occurrences that you're going to get at the end of the 1800s is a wave of discontent by the farmers, and this is going to push back in a big way against the political status quo as these farmers start to make their grievances known. So in the 1800s, the industrialization and the increasing manipulation by the railroads, and especially the mechanization and the corporatization of farms, is going to make life hard for the traditional small independent American farmer. So it's going to be harder for them to compete. It's going to be harder for them to keep up with the new advances. And so farmers are going to be really struggling by the end of the 1800s. And that's what we call this agrarian malaise, right? This discontent with farmers, especially Western farmers. And these farmers are going to feel that they're sort of economically marginalized and politically marginalized. And so they're going to feel like they have a lot of these grievances, and nobody is listening to these problems that these farmers are undergoing. And so this discontent by the farmers is going to explode on the political stage in the last few decades of the 1800s. So the first outgrowth of this agrarian malaise is going to be in something that we call the Grange or the Grainger movements of the 1860s and the 70s. And Grange, the term the Grange refers to a loosely related group of farmers' cooperative organizations, and they called these organizations Granges, and the farmers who participated in these organizations, they called them Grangers. And these Granges initially popped up as cooperatives for farmers that focused on local problems. So they would help farmers band together to solve issues like supply, sharing knowledge back and forth, grouping crops that they would farm and to sell them directly to market rather than going through middlemen who would take a cut of the profits away from the farmers. So these Granges started to pop up in all sorts of locales, and the more Granges that you got, the more they started to cooperate back and forth. And the more they started to exercise cooperation in political arenas as well as just economic arenas. So these Granges actually start to endorse political candidates on the local level and the state level. And they enjoy some success endorsing these candidates, and especially in the western states, which is where you have the largest influence of the Grange. Lots of these state legislatures had pretty significant parts of the legislature that were made up of Grange approved candidates. So one of the ways that you see the Grange exercising political influence is in a series of Grainger Laws that get passed in several different states in the 1870s. And these Grainger Laws had the effect of trying to place caps on the rates that railroads could charge farmers. But unfortunately, even though these laws passed the state legislature, they were struck down in many cases by the courts. So the Grangers and the Grainger movement was big, and it was kind of this first instance of farmers exercising their discontent, but unfortunately didn't have too many long-lasting consequences. So as the Grange the participation in these Granges starts to decline in the 1870s, a new form of farmers cooperatives starts to emerge to take their place. And these cooperatives are called farmers' alliances. And they're going to be very similar to the Granges, but they're going to be a little bit bigger. They're going to be a little bit better organized, and they're going to be they're going to have a more explicit political slant. So whereas the Granges were more focused on solving economic and local type problems, the farmers' alliances are going to try and address the grievances of the farmers in a political manner. So they're going to kind of overtly try to endorse and get candidates into office who are sympathetic with the plight of the farmers. So the farmers' alliances are going to pop up in sort of the 1870s and throughout the 1880s and the 1890s, and they are going to be very successful in getting candidates into office, again, especially in the western states, who are very sympathetic to getting agrarian legislation passed. So actually in the 1890 election, they are going to win 12, so complete control of 12 state legislatures, 6 governor's office, 3 senators, and perhaps a dozen or so representatives in the US Congress. So this is going to be a pretty serious amount of political muscle that these farmers' alliances are going to flex. And remember that we characterized the politics of the 1800s as a largely kind of being in the state of equilibrium. This farmers' malaise, these farmers' alliances are going to start to rock the boat a little bit and upset that state of equilibrium. So both the traditional Democrats and traditional Republicans are going to start looking at, especially what happens in the election of 1890, and saying, whoa, something's going on here. Something's bubbling up underneath the surface, and our boat's getting rocked. So, the farmers' alliances are eventually going to organize themselves even more explicitly, and they are going, this movement of the farmers is going to morph into an official political party called the People's Party. And as historians, we look back on this People's Party, and the informal name that we give to this People's Party, these farmers, these Grangers, is the Populist Party. And so populism is the name that we historians have given to this rising of farmers' discontent. So populism is a really specific political ideology. And when we say something is populist, what we say is that it's a Okay, once again, sorry about that. Computer froze up or went to sleep again on me. So, returning back to the Populist Party. So, talking about populism, the ideology. Populism is an ideology where you advocate for positions or laws or acts that benefit the common person. So, a good example of populism is actually President Trump. Many people consider a populist type candidate, because if you look at his presidency, he is very focused on your sort of blue collar American workers who have been left behind by globalism, right? The MAGA, Make American Great Again types. So Trump is going to be a current type of populism, but the end of the 1800s, the Grangers and the farmers' alliances are definitely populists as well, because they focus on issues that help the common, average, everyday farmer, right? This is in contrast to like the Republicans and the conservatives, the laissez-faire attitude that is for the big business owners. The populists are going to advocate for policies that help these farmers who have been marginalized and left behind. So the populists at the end of the 1800s, the constituency, the people who make up the Populist Party, is going to be primarily driven by farmers, especially in the South and in the West. And these farmers, as an outgrowth of the Grainger movement and the Farmers Alliance movement, these farmers are going to politically organize themselves and start to flex their political muscle. And that is going to form in the People's Party, which is a legitimate party that is created out of this movement of populists, and it's going to form the one of the first true, really big third parties that we get in American history outside the Democrats and the Republicans. So the Populist Party, well, let's talk about its ideas specifically, right? Other than just kind of generally being in favor of the common everyday people. So what did these populists want? What were the planks in their platform? So the ideas of the Populist Party, one of the big ones is this notion of free silver. So we've talked about the impact that the monetary supply or the money supply has had, especially for people in the West, right? That these farmers, one of the biggest struggles that Western farmers have are getting cash or borrowing money to be able to buy new farmland, to buy seed and materials for their farms. And the fact that cash, the money supply was smaller, especially in the West, made that, because that resource was scarce, borrowing money was really expensive, right? Interest rates on loans were really high, and farmers couldn't afford the interest rates a lot of times. So the big thing that the farmers wanted to do was they wanted to monetize silver and to coin silver and to make silver a legitimately acceptable version of money. And in so doing, they would expand the monetary supply to make interest rates go down so that they could borrow for their farms. So that was one of the things that and you can tell this policy would be very helpful for farmers specifically, right? The banks, the corporations, the people who already had money going out, they didn't want this inflation to occur because that would reduce the value of the loans that they had already given out. So free silver or coining silver was as a policy would definitely benefit the farmers over sort of the corporate and the bank interests, right? So that was definitely a Populist Party plank. Another thing that the Populist Party wanted was the government to establish public warehouses for farm goods so that instead of having to harvest their crops and then sell them right away in the market, these farmers could place these crops in public warehouses on government credit and then wait for the price to move in a direction that was favorable for these crops, and then they could sell them. So they would be these great big warehouses paid for by tax money that would help farmers store their crops until a moment that would or a moment came up to sell them where the price was more favorable to the farmers. Another thing that these populists wanted was the end of absentee land ownership. So we've talked about how a lot of times, like, the railroads would buy up all the best land in the West and then sell it off to people. And oftentimes this really good farmland wasn't occupied at all. It would be owned by some big wealthy landowner back out east. And so the farmer or the populists were trying to say, hey, this isn't a good situation. This is good farmland. If you're going to own farmland, you should live on it, right? Or else this land is just going to waste not being used. So we need to end absentee land ownership. Finally, the People's Party, and this is perhaps where they changed this the most strenuously, they expressed a very anti-laissez-faire ideology. So this notion that the government should keep its hands out of politics, populists said, nope, that's only working for your big corporate interests and your monopolies. In order to help our average everyday farmers, we have to have the government get involved in everyday life and help people, right? Survival of the fittest, not a good ideology. So, the Populist Party, the People's Party, is actually going to poll about 8% of the national vote in 1892, which is a huge amount of the vote for a third party to get, right? 8% of the vote. Very substantial. So this is going to take us into the decade of the 90s, which is going to be a very turbulent decade. So if up until this point politics had been in a state of equilibrium, this is where the boat is definitely going to be rocked. So in 1893, several large banks and corporations are going to collapse, and this is going to put stress on the American economy, and it's going to expose lots of industries where businesses had been overexpanding and borrowing too much money, and they were exposed to an economic downturn like this. So you're going to get a pretty big economic contraction, a depression, and some bank failures, which is going to shrink that money supply even further. So it's going to put even more pressure on the Western farmers. So this is going to bring the free silver question to the fore in a really big way. And the populists are going to pick this up as sort of their flag, right? Their rallying cry for their political party. And Cleveland, who's going to be the president at the time, Democrat Grover Cleveland, is going to blame the downturn in 1893 on unstable currency. So he's going to say the problem with this isn't the size of the monetary supply, it's that the currency that we do have is allowed to fluctuate in value too much. And so what he's going to argue is instead of putting silver into the monetary supply to inflate the monetary supply and mess around with the value of money, we need to actually double down on a hard currency, on gold currency, something that's going to keep its value really well. So obviously you have the populists on one hand advocating monetizing silver and expanding the monetary supply, Cleveland trying to keep the monetary supply steady and stable. So naturally, this is going to kind of set these two, the conservative monetarists and the silver monetarists, are going to be set in opposition to one another. At the 1896 Democratic Convention, a man named William Jennings Bryan, who is your picture at the right-hand side of this slide, he is going to make a very famous speech called his Cross of Gold speech, where he is going to very eloquently and passionately advocate for monetizing silver, and basically finished up this speech by saying, you Eastern gold people will not place down this crown of thorns upon the farmer. You will not crucify us on a cross of gold. Basically saying that if you keep the monetary supply with only gold, you are going to run the monetary supply in a disastrous way for the farmers. So if we don't monetize silver, it's going to be big trouble for the farmers. So William Jennings Bryan is going to enjoy enormous popularity as a result of this Cross of Gold speech, and he's actually going to be made the candidate for the Democratic Party for the presidency. And he is going to be placed in opposition in this 1896 campaign with William McKinley, who was the author of that tariff that set the tariff rates really high. McKinley is going to reflect these sort of more laissez-faire, more corporate, more conservative Republican type interests. So obviously McKinley is going to be in favor of keeping the gold standard, right? So it's going to be the Democrats with William Jennings Bryan wanting to monetize silver, and McKinley with the Republicans who wants to keep the gold standard. And the populists are going to have really a hard time with this, because the populists have really taken up this silver question, right? This has been their rallying cry. And so the fact that the Democrats nominated a guy who was so in favor of monetizing silver, the populists could either support the Democrats because this was a thing that they really wanted, and if they would do so, then it might get enacted. But if they supported the Democrats, that really undermines this third party that has lots of momentum. So this is hard for the populists to do, and what they eventually decide to do is to fuse with the Democrats and support William Jennings Bryan for the presidency. And unfortunately for the populists, McKinley and the Republicans win this election. So apparently more Americans are in favor of the gold standard than they are monetizing silver. So this kind of signals the end of the Populist Party as McKinley becomes president. The United States starts to climb out of that recession that happens in 1893, and McKinley is going to wind up enshrining the gold standard in law in 1900. All right, so last slide here. We are almost done. So the end of the 1800s, after this populist wave has rocked the boat in American politics, another big trend that is going on in the United States at this point is actually not so much what's going on in the United States, but rather what's happening for lots of the Western countries, such as Britain, France, Germany, the United States. And the big thing that we see for these Western powers at the end of the 1800s is a trend towards imperialism, which means these countries were trying to establish empires. They were trying to gain colonial possessions across the world. And so there was kind of like almost like a keeping up with the Joneses situation, where Britain would gain some new colonies, and to try and keep up, Germany would want to gain new colonies, and France would want to gain new colonies. And the United States was looking at all these Western powers and how they were gaining more colonies, and they were thinking, man, these countries are gaining lots of places, and we should really maybe consider trying to keep up with these countries, right? This is kind of an expression of that old manifest destiny tendency that we had in the early 1800s. And the United States was kind of had several motivations for doing this. First is that they didn't want all these European powers to wind up with all these colonies and then have the United States locked out of trading with these different areas around the globe. Because as the American economy expanded, in order to find places to sell all these goods that were being produced by our economy, we needed to sell them overseas. So we didn't want to get locked out of trading with these places. So we wanted to establish colonies of our own to keep our foreign trade going. Another thing that drove American expansionism was a fear of the effects of closing the frontier. And this goes right back to Frederick Jackson Turner and sort of the problems he saw with the closing of the frontier. And Americans thought that sort of in order to remain vigorous and to replenish our democracy, we had to kind of keep expanding and keep focusing on an expanding horizon. So part of this imperialistic impulse was a natural progression of the manifest destiny impulse of the early 1800s. And then finally, kind of the last impulse that drives American imperialism is something called Anglo-Saxonism, which is a term, of course, we've talked about the Anglo-Saxons being the Germanic ancestors of the English and the English-speaking people around the world, like the English, the British, and the Americans. So Americans were looking at sort of American culture, and they were looking at American culture and the American language and the American political system and the American economic system and saying, hey, we've kind of got what looks to be the most robust, most successful political and economic system that's ever been in the world. So we are, in one sense, superior to other parts of the world, and that gives us a right to expand and to take over places. But also we kind of have this responsibility because we do have these superior institutions. We should be taking these institutions to the other parts of the globe that aren't as lucky and aren't as skilled as we are. So these drives are going to be influencing lots of Americans to advocate for the United States to establish overseas colonies in the late 1800s. So the first instances you're going to get of American imperialism, of new American colonies, are going to be in Hawaii in 1893 and Samoa in 1899. And throughout the 1800s in Hawaii, more and more American business owners had been moving to Hawaii and establishing like sugar plantations. This built closer and closer economic ties to the United States until gradually this sort of relatively small group of American plantation owners on Hawaii overthrew the Hawaiian monarchy and actually did it with the support of American Marines. So this was perhaps a little bit underhanded, but regardless, in 1893, Hawaii gets annexed by the United States and becomes an American territory. The big event that we tend to equate with imperialism during this period, though, gets its start in Cuba. So if you look at a map of Cuba, you will see that Cuba is really, really close to Florida, to the American mainland. So when Americans were looking at different territories that we could expand into, one of the really natural geographic locations that people saw to expand into was Cuba because it was so close. So a lot of Americans were already kind of looking at Cuba and saying that would be a good place to expand into. Well, throughout the 1800s, the Cubans had been revolting against their current colonial masters, the Spanish. And in 1895, an especially fierce revolt was going to break out. And the Spanish methods of trying to put down this revolt in Cuba were going to become very violent and very almost inhumane. It's going to be a very bitter struggle fought between the Cubans and the Spanish. And this is going to have an interesting coincidence that this revolt is going to break out at the same time that the United States is interested in expanding into territories, and also at the same time that two men are going to be competing to sell more newspapers. So they're going to be two men that own two of the main newspapers in the United States, and that's Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. And these two newspaper owners are trying to sell more newspapers, right? So they're trying to each one up each other on the scoops that they get. And we're going to call this yellow journalism. That's what historians call this period. It's yellow journalism, because these two guys are basically going to take the stories that they can get and make them sound as sensational as they can to try and sell the most amount of newspapers. So these two guys are basically going to be looking for any excuse to find something that they can use to sell newspapers, right? So this Cuban revolt, this Cuban crisis, note, not the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is going to happen in the Cold War in the 1960s. This is a different Cuban crisis. Okay, these two guys are going to look at this Cuban crisis and they're going to see an opportunity to sell newspapers. So they start sending tons of their journalists down there to try and investigate and find the craziest stories that they can find. And they're going to start sending these stories back to their newspapers back in the United States. They're going to get published. And because these stories are so sensationalized, Americans are going to be looking at what's happening in Cuba and they're going to be saying, this is a humanitarian crisis, right? We need to do something to help out these poor Cubans, right? We need to help them overthrow their Spanish masters. So this yellow journalism is going to influence American support for intervening in this Cuban revolt. So eventually what's going to happen is the United States government is going to send a battleship, the USS Maine, to Cuba to sort of police the affair and to help any Americans who are living on the island get out of this basically this war for independence that was going on. And while the Maine was just sitting in harbor in Cuba, it is going to explode. And it's not clear immediately why it explodes, right? Whether it's the Spanish that blow up the Maine, or whether it's an accident that blows up the Maine, or whether perhaps the Cubans blow up the Maine, right? As a way to blow up the Maine and make the Americans think it's the Spanish so they retaliate. Or perhaps, and this is the most tinfoil hat conspiracy theory, maybe even the United States blows up its own ship as a pretense to get involved in the war. So it's not immediately clear what happens with this event. However, you can bet your bottom dollar that the Pulitzer and Hearst seize upon this event and they make it as sensational as it possible, and they don't wait for the facts and they blame the Spanish for blowing up the Maine. And sort of this sensationalism in the newspapers and the American public drives popular opinion very much for intervening in Cuba, sort of as a retaliation for blowing up our battleship, the Maine. So this initiates the Spanish-American War of 1898. And the Americans are immediately going to mobilize and sort of declare war on Spain and look to retaliate militarily for this. So one of the ways that they're going to retaliate right off the bat is to a guy named Teddy Roosevelt, who is pictured in the picture at the right-hand side of this screen. When this war breaks out in 1898, Roosevelt is going to be serving as the senior undersecretary in the Navy. And so he's going to be like one of the second guys in charge of the Navy. And he is going to kind of issue an order that perhaps he didn't have the authority to issue, but he is going to charge the U.S. Navy with attacking the Spanish fleet in one of the few colonial possessions Spain has left. Here's our final cat right here. This is Mr. Cato. Get out of here, cat. He is going to order the U.S. fleet attack the Spanish fleet in the Philippines, all the way over in Southeast Asia. And the U.S. fleet is going to absolutely trounce the Spanish fleet, which was largely outdated compared to the U.S. fleet. So this is kind of the first area where we're going to see Roosevelt's involvement, is he's going to order the Spanish fleet to attack ordered the American fleet, rather, to attack the Spanish fleet right at the outset of the war. And pretty much right after Roosevelt orders the Spanish fleet do this, he's going to resign his post at the Navy, and he's going to enlist in the Army, and because he just wants to be part of this conflict, right? He's kind of an action seeker, a little bit of an adrenaline junkie. So he is going to enlist in the Army and form a cavalry unit in the American Army called the Rough Riders. So the Rough Riders, because Roosevelt is here, and Roosevelt's famous, he's a former governor of New York, journalists are going to kind of ride with this cavalry unit, the Rough Riders, throughout the Spanish-American War. And as the American army lands in Cuba and starts to attack the Spanish that are there, the journalist reports of the activities of Roosevelt and the Rough Riders are going to be sent back to the papers and are going to be published in Pulitzer's and Hearst's papers. And Roosevelt's going to gain fame and notoriety from the Spanish-American War as a result of that. So, Roosevelt is going to be famous for calling the Spanish-American War and his time in Cuba a splendid little war. So the Spanish Empire was definitely not as strong as it had been in centuries past. It was going broke. It had given up many of its colonial possessions. Its armed forces were out of date. So when the American forces rolled in, even though the army was fresh, it was volunteer basis, our army wasn't very well equipped or very well trained, we kind of just waltzed in and just rolled over the Spanish in Cuba. And we suffered very few combat casualty deaths. And especially for people like Roosevelt, who were kind of adventurous and junkie seekers, or adrenaline junkie adventure seekers, they actually found this conflict a little bit more pleasant, I guess you could say, than a lot of other American wars. Now, that's not to say there wasn't a lot of suffering. In fact, fighting in Cuba, the Americans suffered from like diseases, especially like malaria. But the Americans didn't suffer many casualties at all in this conflict. And we wind up really beating the Spanish across the globe with really minimal casualties. So the Spanish-American War does not last long. The United States kind of wins battle after battle after battle. And the result of this Spanish-American War is that the United States comes out and actually gains many of these Spanish colonial possessions. So as a result of this war, the United States annexes Puerto Rico in the Caribbean. We annex Guam. We annex the Philippines, which is a huge, densely populated territory in the Southeast Pacific. And we don't wind up annexing Cuba, but we wind up turning it into a protectorate where part of the Cuban government is appointed by the United States. And as a result of something called the Platt Amendment, we basically gain veto power over Cuban foreign policy. So Cuba doesn't become a U.S. territory, but it basically becomes a U.S. protectorate, right? So one of the really interesting things that we get in the year 1898 is that the United States goes from being a democracy, a republic, to now we have become a colonial imperial power, a country with territory that we control all across the globe. We're a naval power. We come out of this with a modern, permanent standing army. So it's a little bit of an identity crisis for Americans as we come out of this conflict. And we sort of had valued ourselves as an enlightened society, a democratic society. And all of a sudden we were now a colonial empire, kind of like the British, right? And remember, we got our start as a country rebelling against empire. And now we were an empire. So how is that going to work moving forward? This is why we call the year 1898 a turning point. That's all I have for you today.